Nazareth was not an important city, nor a political center, nor a relevant pilgrimage point. It was a small settlement in Galilee, and that word really does not describe only its size, it describes its way of life. In communities like this, stability did not depend on written laws or large institutions, but on a much more immediate system: reputation. Reputation was capital, it was credit, it was social permission, and when it broke, life became more expensive and more fragile. In Nazareth, almost everything was sustained by family networks and daily work. The economy had little margin. A house was maintained with hands and agreements. Food was secured through harvests, through trade, through orders, through good and bad seasons. People did not accumulate large reserves. That is why the community was not just neighborhood. It was also a survival mechanism. Those inside the circle were helped. Those who were marked or isolated lost support, lost opportunities, and could end up in a slow decline. That environment was ideal for great power to pass by, but it was also ideal for small power, represented in social judgment, to be total. Rome and its authorities did not need to watch every house to control life. The weight of taxes, obligations, and local administration was enough. The impact of the empire was felt above all in economic pressure and in the constant reminder that one lived under dominion. People might not see a legion every day, but they saw collection, they heard decrees, they experienced the sense that their effort sustained a higher structure. Nazareth, on that map, functioned as a periphery. It did not produce official speeches. It did not concentrate wealth. It did not have the visibility of Jerusalem nor the flow of its major routes. And that periphery shaped the character of the place. People were practical, distrustful, strict with the community order. When life is hard, mistakes are punished, and deviation becomes dangerous. Morality, in that context, was not only religion, it was also a tool to preserve the social fabric. Within that framework lived Joseph. His figure is better understood if one looks at his trade before any idealization. Joseph was a craftsman associated with construction and repair work, a trade that in his time involved real manual skill, knowledge of materials, and the ability to solve concrete problems. He was not a noble, he was not an official, he was not a scribe with intellectual prestige. His life was sustained by commissions, and commissions were obtained through trust. In a village, trust is not built with speeches. It is built with continuity, keeping promises, not failing at the basics, not bringing conflicts to others' doors, not becoming involved in scandals. A craftsman who falls under suspicion loses work, and losing work in this system is not a bad month. It unravels the security of the household. That is why for Joseph, honor was not a spiritual ornament, it was a practical necessity. The trade also determined his social place. Joseph did not belong to the religious or political elite. That means he had no tools of power to defend himself if the community pointed him out. His defense was his name, and his name depended on the community continuing to see him as a righteous, trustworthy, and stable man. A sustained rumor could become a sentence without anyone having to sign a document. Mary lived under another type of vulnerability, equally or even more severe. Her life was structured by family, by community norms, and by expectations about the female role. Freedom of movement and decision-making was limited, not because there were no women with character, but because the social structure defined the field of the possible. In that system, a woman's body was not a private matter. It had a public reading, and that public reading was connected to family honor. That is why, when speaking of the bond between Mary and Joseph, one cannot think in terms of a modern courtship. It was a betrothal with social recognition and legal weight. That means the bond already existed as a formal commitment, although full cohabitation had not yet been established. For the community, that commitment was visible. For law and morality, it was serious. Breaking it was not an informal gesture. It implied a recognizable dissolution with clear social effects. This fact creates the true climate of the story. In Nazareth, an event that seems to break the order of the betrothal does not remain private. It becomes a case, and in a small village, a case becomes a narrative becomes reputation, and reputation becomes destiny. The village, moreover, was a space where social control operated daily. It was not necessary for someone to declare themselves a judge. A murmur, a sustained look, selective silences were enough. It was known who entered which house. People commented on who went out with whom. Times were counted, calendars were compared. When moral order is part of community identity, a woman's body becomes a test for others, and a man's conduct becomes a public exam. This explains why Nazareth was an especially dangerous environment for any anomaly. If something did not fit, there was no way to hide it for long. Proximity makes it inevitable, and proximity produces an effect: pressure. Joseph and Mary existed within that pressure even before the break. The life of both was already marked by what was expected. He, to sustain a household, be trustworthy, build. She, to be part of a transition toward marriage, preserve honor, fit into the community order. Expectations were not negotiable in each individual case. They were the rules of the social game, and those who break the rules pay. Mary, betrothal, pregnancy, and the risk of being marked. When the pregnancy became a fact, Mary's life ceased to be a private matter and became a potential public problem. Not because anyone had reported her yet, but because in a community like Nazareth, the body speaks before the person. The time of pregnancy cannot be negotiated. It progresses, it is noticeable, it demands explanations. And, in the social logic of the time, betrothal made that explanation inevitably legal and moral, not just personal. Mary was not in an informal relationship, she was engaged in a recognized bond. This meant that any pregnancy outside the expected framework was, by default, associated with the idea of infidelity or breach of the pact. Even if there was no immediate formal accusation, the mere possibility activated a very concrete social mechanism: suspicion, gossip, progressive isolation. And that mechanism had material consequences. A woman who was marked could lose community support, her family could be put under pressure, her future within marriage could collapse, and the engaged man could also be dragged into discredit. For this reason, the first impact of the pregnancy was not a romantic crisis. It was a survival crisis. Mary had to consider what could happen if the matter became public conversation. In this context, the punishment was not only shame. Shame was the instrument. The social goal was to discipline, mark, and warn. The outcome could range from marginalization to harsher intervention by community authorities, depending on how the case was interpreted and how much example they wanted to make. Mary was also structurally vulnerable. Young, without formal power, and subject to the narrative that others constructed about her. In a world where female credibility could be fragile in the face of collective opinion, it was enough for people to choose one version for that version to become stronger than any explanation. And in these cases, the simplest version usually wins. She strayed, she betrayed, she dishonored. Complexity does not compete well with quick judgment. There is a key point. Even if Mary told the truth about her experience, that truth could not be proven with social evidence. There was no human way to turn a personal revelation into acceptable public proof. And when there is no acceptable evidence, judgment relies on chronologies, months, dates, times. People count, people compare, people decide whether the calendar fits or not. That is why pregnancy was not only a biological fact, it was a matter of social chronology. And social chronology is used as a weapon. In this scenario, silence was not cowardice, it was strategy. Talking too much could accelerate the fire. Silence might not extinguish it, but it could delay it. Mary needed time. She needed a space where the pregnancy could progress without being exposed every day to questions, looks, and comments. At this stage, the logic of moving to a safer family environment is understood, where the presence of an older, respected woman functioned as a buffer. Here, Elizabeth comes in as a point of support. Not as a narrative ornament, but as a practical decision, to find a place where Mary's story would not be immediately crushed by rumor. Elizabeth's house offered two valuable things. First, distance from Nazareth's everyday gaze. Second, an adult figure with moral authority, capable of providing refuge and support without turning the situation into a scandal. In social terms, that matters. A young woman alone and marked is a target. A young woman in the house of a respected relative is harder to attack without cost. That displacement also had an effect on time. By moving away, Mary gained weeks without direct exposure. In a case like this, weeks are gold, because they allow decisions to be organized, allow the family core to think, and prevent the people from taking control of the story before Joseph acts. The key was this. If Joseph reacted impulsively, the case could become publicly irreversible. If Joseph reacted prudently, there was room to manage the damage. But even with refuge, the problem did not solve itself. The central issue remained Joseph, because Mary's fate did not depend solely on what she said, but on what he decided. The formal engagement placed Joseph at the center of the expected social response. The community looked to him to see how he would correct the situation, and in that expectation there is a harsh detail. Often the community forces the man to save his honor at the cost of destroying the woman. Mary, therefore, lived a double tension. On one hand, she had to carry the pregnancy and endure the real physical and emotional impact of that stage. On the other, she depended on a male decision that could define her entire life. If Joseph publicly rejected her, the people would devour her. If Joseph secretly let her go, she could avoid part of the damage but would still be marked. If Joseph supported her, then both remained exposed to suspicion. Joseph, the dilemma, the silent way out, and the command in dreams. Joseph did not need the village to speak to understand what was coming. In a village like Nazareth, news does not enter through a door, it comes through the sum of glances, through strange pauses, through the way a neighbor greets without holding eye contact. Even before anyone dared to say it out loud, the pregnancy was already a fact that would shape everyone's conversation. And with that fact, Joseph found himself caught between two forces that do not usually coexist, the rule and compassion. He knew how the place worked because he lived from it. He knew that his life, his work, and his name depended on a fragile balance. A craftsman can be skilled, but if people stop trusting, skill is not enough. He also knew that Mary was young, and if the village decided to make her an example, the fall could be brutal. The pressure of the community pushes a man to save his honor, and saving honor in practice usually means sacrificing the woman so that the rest can breathe easily. Joseph understood this logic, and precisely because he understood it, he feared it. The most expected reaction would have been public, to break the bond visibly, expel, point out, create distance. That path would have given Joseph immediate social defense. The village would have applauded him as righteous and shifted the full weight onto Mary. But Joseph did not want that way out, not because he was indifferent to his own shame, but because he knew that public exposure was a condemnation. It was not just a formality, it was an open door for others to do the worst in the name of order. That is why his first decision was silent. To separate without scandal, to do what was necessary without lighting the fire. In practical terms, this idea aimed at one thing: to cut the bond with the least possible damage. It was not a perfect solution. It did not leave him clean in front of everyone. The rumors would exist anyway. But it avoided the most dangerous mechanism, the public signal that authorizes the community to punish. This intention shows that Joseph was thinking about consequences, not impulse. In a small place, the difference between a discreet and a public break is not on paper. It is in what the paper allows. A public break turns the woman into a target. A discreet break leaves her wounded but can prevent her from being destroyed. Still, that decision was not light. It meant giving up an already imagined future, accepting the collapse of a project, and enduring humiliation without full defense. Because even in secret, Joseph knew that the village counts months. And those who count months do not need records. They need a calendar and malice. Joseph would still be trapped in a conversation he could not control. That night, the conflict became harsher, not as an external argument, but as an internal struggle. Joseph's problem was not only social, it was moral. He could not pretend that nothing had happened. He could not pretend that the world had stayed the same. And at the same time, he did not want to turn his pain into violence. This point is what kept him in tension, the wounded man who does not want to hurt to relieve himself. In this state, the dream interrupted the logic he was following. It was not a confusing dream, nor a mix of meaningless images. It was an experience of direction, one remembered for the clarity with which it changes a decision. In the dream, the instruction came straight. Do not be afraid to receive Mary and maintain the bond. The phrase hit the exact nerve. The fear was real. It was fear of the judgment of the village, fear of being marked, fear that his life would completely fall apart, fear that he could not protect her, fear of what people would do if they felt authorized. The dream did not deny these dangers. It confronted them with a mandate: do not move out of fear. And the reason for the mandate was even more decisive. The origin of the pregnancy should not be read as betrayal. What Joseph saw as a breach of the pact had to be understood differently. A divine action, an intervention that did not depend on human decisions. This changed the entire axis of the conflict. If Joseph obeyed, he was no longer covering a scandal, he was sustaining a mission. If Joseph obeyed, he was no longer a man trying to minimize damage, he was a man taking a stand before a higher command. This inversion did not resolve the social problem, it made it more complex. Because accepting Mary also meant accepting that the community would not believe him. There was no way to prove that origin so that the village would recognize it as evidence. The village does not operate on revelation, it operates on interpretation and control. If Joseph received Mary, he would be exposed to suspicion for life. People could conclude that he was the biological father and that everything had happened ahead of time, or they could conclude that he was weak, or they could conclude anything that fit their moral view. But the dream did not offer a negotiated way out, it offered a path to sustain, and to sustain in this case was much more than marrying or cohabiting. It was to put the body as a shield. It was to bear the weight of a story that could not be explained in normal terms. It was to live with the cost of other people's gaze to protect Mary from the direct blow. Joseph awoke with a new decision, one that did not arise from social logic but from obedience. And that decision, to be effective, had to be practical. Believing was not enough. He had to act. In a small community, actions are what shape the story. If Joseph received Mary, he had to do it clearly, without half measures, without signs of doubt, without gestures that feed the rumor. The village would speak anyway, but Joseph's firmness could prevent the rumor from becoming an invitation to aggression. Receiving her also meant reorganizing the household, not only emotionally but in daily life, protecting her from exposure, supporting her needs, ensuring the pregnancy progressed with the least possible harm, reducing unnecessary contacts, preventing the conflict from becoming a public matter. In other words, Joseph assumed the role of legal supporter and practical protector in a total sense, and that acceptance did not erase the inner conflict. Joseph did not turn into a statue without doubts. He remained a man who knew how the world works. He knew that other people's judgment does not stop with a private revelation. But now, the center of his decision was no longer escaping judgment. It was sustaining what he had been commanded to sustain. At that point, the story ceased to depend on the rumor in Nazareth and began to depend on external forces. Because even if Joseph managed to mitigate local pressure, there was a larger mechanism that asked no one for permission: imperial power and its decrees. The life of a family could be on the edge due to an intimate matter and still be pushed to move through an administrative formality. That was part of the time. The individual adapts or breaks. Joseph, already determined to sustain Mary, understood that his task was not to convince the village but to keep his family united and standing. And that task, at the most delicate moment of the pregnancy, was going to collide with an order from above, an order that made no distinction between a peaceful house and a house on the brink of collapse, the registration that required everyone to present themselves in their place of origin. The decree of Augustus and the birth in Bethlehem. The decree came out of Rome as orders of an empire do, without asking whom it would break. Caesar Augustus needed numbers, control, and registered loyalty, and the decree obliged every family to register according to their lineage. It was not just an administrative count, it could also be read as a record of obedience to the imperial system, a way to tie every house to the Roman machinery. For Joseph, this order had an immediate consequence: to return to the place associated with his ancestors, because his family line was linked to David, and that pushed him toward Bethlehem in Judea. The problem was not theoretical. Bethlehem was about 145 kilometers south of Nazareth, and Mary was already in her last months. It was not a trip planned for comfort. It was an obligation that fell precisely when Mary's body began to demand rest. Joseph had already taken his position before the village, to maintain the bond, to support Mary, to support the pregnancy under pressure. They had formalized their life together, and Joseph had exercised self-control, which was no minor detail in a village where everyone watched. The marriage was not consummated before the birth as a way to protect the mystery, and also to avoid any signs that could fuel even more destructive interpretations. With that reality above them, the order from Rome left no room for delay. They had to move. The road to Bethlehem had at least two clear options. There was a shorter route through Samaria, about 70 kilometers, but it was dangerous because it involved crossing a territory where Jews could be attacked. There was a longer route through the Jordan Valley, safer in terms of hostility, but more physically exhausting because it doubled the distance and required enduring several days of walking. In either case, the cost was high. For Joseph, due to logistical responsibility and the risk of the route, and for Mary, due to the physical burden of an advanced pregnancy in motion. The decree affected not only them, it pushed thousands. That is why Bethlehem did not wait for them calmly. A small town suddenly absorbed waves of people returning out of obligation. The natural consequence was overcrowding, full houses, occupied courtyards, corners turned into improvised beds. It was not a world with available hotels. It was a world where hospitality depended on real space, and the real space had run out. The arrival did not erase the fatigue of the journey, it accumulated it. Joseph had to solve the essentials in a few hours: where to stay, how to protect Mary, how to find a place where she could give birth if labor began. But the scene was the worst possible for a calm search. Too many doors, too many people, too much noise and little patience. No one was waiting for a couple from Galilee. Most were trying to survive their own crowding. Under that pressure, the solution ended up being the one taken when there is no ideal option, accepting a place that was not a formal room. The family stayed on the lower level or in the most precarious shelter space, the kind of area where additional people concentrated when the main house was full. Years later, the memory of that overcrowding remained part of the picture. They were not installed in a spacious house from the beginning, but first in a crowded space, and only later could they live more stably in Bethlehem. The birth took place in this framework, without preparation time, without guaranteed privacy, in a context of urgency. And what remained as a sign was not a banner or a public proclamation, but a domestic scene of extreme vulnerability, the child wrapped in cloths and laid in a manger. The cloths were not ornament, they were method. In that culture, wrapping a newborn served to provide warmth, support, and protection to a body that had just come into the world. The phrase that would later be repeated as a sign did not describe luxury, it described fragility. A dependent baby placed in the most available and stable spot that could be cleared at that moment. The manger was also not a poetic image born from later imagination. It was a real object, a feeder, a fixed container used to feed animals. At the moment of birth, it functioned as a useful surface because it was sturdy, because it was at hand, because it could be emptied, and because in a crowded space it allowed the child to be placed in a relatively safe spot while the house remained full of movement. The sign, therefore, did not speak of power. It spoke of a beginning without visible privileges. Joseph became the immediate support for everything. He had brought Mary there by imperial obligation, had obtained the only available space, and now had the newborn child in his hands as an irreversible fact. It was not the time to think about reputation, rumors, or explanations. It was the time to maintain warmth, ensure water, support Mary in the postpartum period, prevent others' chaos from entering their corner. The world kept turning outside, but for them, the world had been reduced to the basics: breathing, shelter, survival. And thus, in a city overcrowded by a Roman order, the Son was born without a stage, without public announcement, wrapped in cloths and laid in a manger. The night of the shepherds and the first news that overflowed. The night continued as usual in the fields near Bethlehem. There were shepherds on guard, watching over the flock in the open, taking turns so as not to fall asleep, alert to wolves, thieves, and any unusual movement in the darkness. They were not priests or scribes. They were not men trained to speak publicly or to maintain an official version of anything. Their profession left them on the social margin. They were considered ritually unclean due to constant contact with animals, and their reputation could be so low that, in certain contexts, their word carried no weight as a respectable witness. That same night, the narrative does not describe a slow sign or a subjective impression that could be mistaken for fatigue. It describes an intrusion. The presence appears suddenly, and the reaction is physical, immediate, paralyzing fear. The message begins with the only sentence that can cut through that fear: "Do not be afraid," and immediately delivers the news with precision that leaves no room for gentle interpretation. Good news of great joy for all the people, the birth of a Savior in the city of David, Christ the Lord. The titles are not set as poetry, they are set as identification: Savior, Messiah, Lord. Words that, if spoken in the wrong place, could sound dangerous, but that night they were addressed to men living outside the city, far from the power structures. The most concrete element was the sign. They were not promised a star over a palace or a procession. They were given verifiable information. They would find the child wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. Confirmation would not be invisible grandeur, it would be vulnerability. A newborn lying in a feeding trough in the least ceremonial place possible, as if the message emphasized from the first moment that this would not follow the codes of human prestige. The sky did not stop at one messenger. The scene expanded with a multitude of the heavenly host, a choral presence that transforms the announcement into a proclamation: glory to God and peace on earth. The image is strange in its contrast, an army that comes not to impose but to declare peace. A troop that does not surround a human throne, but appears over a shepherd's field, and when that presence withdraws, the night returns to its usual state: cold, darkness, earth, animals breathing. The shepherds did not stay debating whether they had imagined it. They made an immediate decision: go to Bethlehem and see what had been announced to them. This involves a real cost, as leaving a flock at night exposes them to losses. Still, they left urgently. They reached the town and searched as one would in such a situation, asking, going from house to house, tracking until they found the scene that matched the sign. And they found it. Joseph, Mary, and the child in the described location, wrapped in cloths and lying in the manger. At that moment, the story ceased to be a secret kept within a family, for the shepherds did not remain silent. They told what they had seen and what had been told to them about the child. And they told it as one tells it who is still trembling from what happened, without institutional filter, without protocol, with the conviction of someone who believes they have received impossible news. The reaction of those who heard it was amazement. Amazement does not mean automatic faith, but it does mean that the story began to circulate. And what circulates, in a city crowded due to an imperial decree, can quickly reach unexpected ears. For Joseph, this visit had a double edge. It confirmed that the child was not just a story maintained in private. There were external witnesses, even if marginal. But it also opened exposure. Bethlehem was saturated, with people coming and going, with overcrowded families, with patience at its limit. A group of men reporting that the Messiah had been born and pointing out a house could attract curiosity. But it could also attract dangerous eyes if someone with political interest heard the wrong word. Mary reacted differently. She did not respond by proclaiming or arguing, but by keeping. The narrative emphasizes an inner gesture. Mary preserved these events and was pondering them in her heart, like someone assembling pieces that do not yet fully fit. The announcement in the field, the titles spoken about her son, the sign of the manger, the arrival of strangers with that certainty, none of this could be resolved with a simple explanation. It accumulated as evidence that did not yet form a complete picture. She did not turn it into a speech. She kept it as organized memory. The shepherds returned to their work, glorifying God for what they had heard and seen, and the house after the movement returned to relative silence, the kind of silence that remains when outside voices fade and the basics return. A baby needing food and warmth, a mother recovering from childbirth, a father adjusting the environment so life would not fall apart. That life did not become easier because of heavenly announcements. It remained the life of the poor in a harsh world. But time passed, and with time came the religious obligation that could not be ignored. The law dictated a procedure after birth. There was a defined period after which the mother had to present herself with offerings for purification. In addition, the firstborn son had to be redeemed with a specific payment to the priest. This was not a symbolic gesture without cost. It involved concrete resources and travel. Joseph and Mary were not in a position to present themselves as a well-off family. The same law took this reality into account. If they could not offer a lamb, they could present 2 birds. This clause precisely positioned them socially. Their compliance followed the path of those who had no more, and yet they complied. They prepared the permitted offerings and gathered the money necessary for the redemption of the firstborn. With the child in their arms and the offerings in hand, they set out from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, about 10 kilometers, to present themselves at the temple and carry out what was required. the presentation in the temple and the prophecies of Simeon and Anna. 40 days after the birth, it was time to fulfill the law. The journey from Bethlehem to Jerusalem was short, about 10 kilometers, but symbolically enormous. On this route, the poverty of a working family intersected with the solemnity of Israel's greatest religious center. Joseph carried with him the money for the redemption of the firstborn, 5 silver shekels, the amount required by the law. Mary carried 2 turtle doves, which replaced the lamb of the wealthy. Thus, without escorts or ceremonies, they entered the temple with a wrapped baby, a tired mother, and a silent father. The temple in Jerusalem was not just a building, it was an entire world, with levels of access, courtyards, stairs, and officials. The rich offered costly sacrifices. The poor waited their turn with animals in their hands. The noise was constant, bleating, murmurs, chants, footsteps. Amid that anonymous crowd, the couple with the child did not draw attention. But there was an old man who was waiting for them, even if he did not fully realize it. His name was Simeon. Sources describe him as a righteous and devout man, sustained by a promise that had accompanied him for years. He would not die without seeing the Messiah. It was a personal expectation, but also a national one. In times of Roman rule, many dreamed of political liberation. Simeon, however, awaited something different, the consolation of Israel, an expression that spoke more of spiritual redemption than military victory. According to the account, the Spirit moved him that day to enter the temple. There was no heavenly voice or external sign, only a clear impulse, the kind of inner certainty that places someone in the right spot at the exact moment. When he saw the couple with the child, he did not ask for credentials or signs. He recognized them. He took the baby in his arms and spoke words that would later be recorded as a farewell prayer. "Now, Lord, you dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and glory for your people Israel." It was not a private blessing. It was a synthesis of the child's destiny. Simeon saw in that small body something that neither the temple authorities nor the priests could see, a salvation that would not be exclusive to Israel but for all nations. Joseph and Mary listened. Surprise mingled with respect. Simeon blessed them, but his following words were not reassuring. He turned to Mary and spoke of a future that would wound her. "This child is set for the fall and rise of many in Israel, and for a sign that will be opposed, and a sword will pierce your own soul." It was a prophecy within joy, a warning within light. These were not human threats, but the inevitable cost of a life that, by revealing the truth, would divide hearts. As Simeon spoke, another figure approached. It was an elderly woman named Anna, daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher, a widow for decades devoted to the temple, known for her life of prayer and fasting. She lived in the inner part of the temple enclosure, serving God day and night. She also recognized the child. She asked nothing. She gave thanks to God and began speaking about this baby to all who awaited the redemption of Jerusalem. 2 witnesses, 1 man and 1 woman, 2 generations who had waited all their lives, saw what the rest did not see. The ritual continued. Joseph paid the 5 shekels. The priest received the coins and performed the blessing. The turtle doves were offered according to the mandate, one for the burnt offering, the other for the sin offering. There was no pomp or public attention. Once the ceremony was finished, the family descended the temple steps and went out into the bustle of the streets. Among merchants, pilgrims, and priests, they were lost as just another group among the many who came and went each day. But Mary now carried something different. Not only the memory of angels and shepherds, but words that could not be forgotten. The contrast was strong. A poor child presented among the rich in the temple, 2 elders speaking of salvation and light, and a prophecy that introduced the idea of pain amid hope. By human logic, birth should have been only joy. By Simeon's logic, it was also an announcement of conflict. "A sword will pierce your soul." No one knew when or how, but these words remained engraved as a shadow that would accompany Mary as the child grew. Having fulfilled the law, the family returned to Bethlehem. There, life resumed its possible rhythm. Joseph went back to work, repairing, building, taking orders. Mary cared for the little one, who was no longer the newborn of the first night, but a child beginning to hold himself in her arms, to look around with curiosity and to reach out to everything he saw. The account mentions that Mary preserved every gesture, every smile, every word. Not as an ordinary mother, but as someone who perceived signs in the everyday that needed to be remembered. Time passed without incident. Bethlehem absorbed them as any city absorbs those who stay. Joseph was known for his craft, and the child grew with the strength and intelligence of one who observes and learns. But the echo of that day in the temple was not erased. In the silences of the night, Mary reviewed the elders' words and kept them along with the others. The angel's announcement, the impossible journey, the birth in a borrowed place, the shepherds, the songs in the dark, and now the promised sword. She did not understand the form that pain would take, but she already knew that the purest love could carry the deepest wound. Years later, when life in Nazareth returned to normal and Jesus grew up amid play, work, and learning, that prophecy would still be waiting, like a shadow at the edge of the heart. What Simeon and Anna had seen in the temple was not just a baby, it was a story that was only beginning to unfold. And at some point in its course, when Mary would be at the foot of a cross, she would remember that day, that elderly man, that warning, and finally understand what it had meant. A sword indeed had pierced her soul. The Magi, Herod's calculation, and the flight to Egypt. Upon leaving the temple, Joseph and Mary returned to Bethlehem with the feeling that they had fulfilled what was required, but also with a new unease. In Jerusalem, no one had stopped them, no one had asked uncomfortable questions, no one had made a scene. In the eyes of the most closely watched place in Judea, they were just another poor family with a baby in their arms. In Bethlehem, life once again compressed to the basics: food, rest, work, and the attempt to maintain a certain normality in a city still affected by the flow of people. Over the weeks, that normality became more stable. The child was no longer the newborn of the first night. He grew, strengthened, and the family adapted to a possible routine. During this period, once they were more firmly settled, the visitors who would change the balance arrived. They were not shepherds from the fields, nor did they come from the immediate surroundings. They came from the east, and the story that brings them does not describe them as kings nor specify an exact number. They are identified by their function: men associated with observing celestial signs, travelers who interpreted the sky as a language and had decided to act according to what they believed they had seen. Their first mistake, also considered by many as their first inevitable act, was to search in Jerusalem. In a society with a king who was a client of Rome, asking about a newborn king is not curiosity, it is a shot fired. In the capital, news does not stay on the street, it rises. Herod received it as the powerful receive any rumor that smells of threat with fear and method. He did not ask if it was true, he asked where and when. He did not act out of devotion, he acted out of calculation. Herod already knew the symbolic terrain. Judea was charged with ancient expectations, and Bethlehem was not just any town. It was the name that connected with the memory of David and the idea of promised kingship. So the king did what rulers acting out of paranoia do. He called the experts of the texts, asked for interpretations, located the place indicated by tradition, and turned a prophecy into an operational map. Then he spoke with the Magi in private. He wanted precision, not poetry. He extracted the crucial information when the sign had appeared. For in the thinking of a man like Herod, time translates into a window of action. With this information, he gave them a disguised order. Go to Bethlehem, find the child, and return to inform him, supposedly so that he could also go to worship him. The mask was perfect, religious courtesy serving a political intent. The Magi went to Bethlehem, and when they found the house, the scene was not a palace. It was that of a royal family in the rawest sense: a small child, a young mother, a father without rank, surroundings without luxury. Yet they did what they had come to do. They knelt and offered gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. 3 objects which in the ancient world had value and meaning: tangible wealth, ritual elements, and a substance associated with both perfume and embalming. For Joseph, these gifts were a dangerous blessing. The gold could support them if work was lacking, but it could also expose them if someone asked where it came from. In a context of widespread poverty, luxury attracts looks and questions travel. But the greater threat was not the curiosity of the people, it was the king who had already calculated. The Magi, however, did not return to Jerusalem. The account says they received a warning in a dream. "Do not return to Herod." They took another route and disappeared from the political scene before becoming instruments of the palace. The decision, although it saved them from complicity, did not deactivate the mechanism, it activated it. Herod waited for their return. When he understood they would not come back, he interpreted their absence as mockery. And for a king like him, mockery is not punished with diplomacy. It is punished with preventive violence. Without an exact point, his mind chose a brutal solution: erase the problem broadly. Instead of killing an identified child, he decided to eliminate all children who could fit within the time frame he had calculated. This order, known in tradition as the Massacre of the Innocents, is part of Matthew's account and has been discussed by historians regarding its scope and external corroboration, but it fits the profile that ancient sources describe of Herod, a ruler capable of extreme measures to protect his throne. While this was underway, the warning came to Joseph, again via a dream. There was no debate, no time to plan. The instruction was urgent: rise, take the child and his mother, and flee. The decisive detail was the destination: Egypt. Leaving Judea meant leaving the immediate radius where Herod could act quickly and crossing into a territory where the pursuit would not be as effective. Joseph had no time for farewells or explanations. A nighttime flight is the only flight that works when the enemy controls routes, rumors, and authorities. They prepared the minimum: clothing, some food, the child wrapped, and the decision to walk. If they took some of the gold with them, it was not out of greed but logic. An exile is sustained with resources, and a displaced craftsman needs time to rebuild clientele. The road to Egypt was not a stroll. It involved crossing desert areas and routes where safety depended on not being isolated. For a family with a small child, the risk was constant: hunger, illness, violence. But the danger of staying was worse, because it was targeted. The flight transforms a family into refugees, people who move not by choice, but because power has decided that their existence is intolerable. Egypt, moreover, was not a cultural void. There were ancient and extensive Jewish communities, especially in cities like Alexandria, and this presence could provide minimal networks, shared language, familiar religious practices, and a certain possibility of integrating without being completely alone. It does not mean it was easy, it means it was possible. Thus, Joseph took Mary and the child out of Judea before the violence reached their door, and they settled across the border, living in a foreign land, sustained by work and anonymity, while Herod's terror fell on the houses in Bethlehem that had nowhere to flee. Egypt, the death of Herod, and the cautious return to Galilee. In Egypt, the family's life was reduced to what can sustain an exile: anonymity, work, and silence. They did not have a wide, guaranteed network, but they were not falling into absolute emptiness either. Egypt had had a significant Jewish presence for generations, especially in urban centers where the diaspora had grown and integrated into the local economy. This reality made it possible for a man like Joseph to find work without having to explain too much of his story, repairing, adjusting, building, solving what others could not solve with their own hands. Exile, however, was not a rest. It was life on pause under constant alert. The border was not a perfect shield, it was distance, and sometimes distance is the only thing separating a family from a death order. Joseph had to measure everything: where to live, whom to speak to, what to say, what to keep silent about. A craftsman earns his bread by talking with clients and neighbors, but a fugitive learns to speak minimally. Mary, meanwhile, was maintaining the child's upbringing on foreign soil without the support of her original environment, with a child growing up unaware that his name, although not yet circulating, was linked to a political threat. Time passed as it does in exile, without grand dates but leaving traces. Jesus ceased to be a fragile baby and became a small child, with new strength in his legs, a hunger to explore, that mix of dependence and will that changes the rhythm of a household. At this stage, survival became more demanding. A child who crawls and then walks forces a home to be safer, to have more food, to maintain more routines. And those routines, in a place that is not yours, cost twice as much. The threat that had expelled them, meanwhile, remained active in Judea. Herod was at the center of this danger, and as long as Herod lived, there was no possible return. But personal power has a biological limit. Herod became ill, deteriorated, and died. With his death, the direct persecution lost the man who had ordered it. The news opened a door but did not guarantee safety. Because the kingdom did not disappear with the king, it reorganized. Herod's territory was divided among his sons, and the most sensitive region, Judea with Jerusalem, remained under Archelaus's control. That name mattered because Archelaus was not a minor ruler. He had authority and a reputation for violence. Internal tensions in Judea had not decreased with Herod's death. In some aspects, they had become more unpredictable. At this point, once again, the dream acted as guidance. Joseph received the instruction to return to the land of Israel. The immediate danger had passed. Those who sought the child's life were no longer present. But returning did not mean going back to the starting point as if nothing had happened. It meant re-entering a territory where politics were being reshuffled, where the names of the rulers had changed, but the practices of control were still alive. Joseph prepared for the return with caution that was already part of his character. Returning meant crossing roads, exposing himself to checkpoints, depending on luck on routes where security was irregular. But returning also offered something Egypt could not give: full cultural belonging, familiar community life, and the possibility of raising the child in his own land without living forever as a foreigner. The first logical impulse would have been to return to Judea, perhaps to Bethlehem, where the child was born and where they had already lived for a time. However, that option collided with a concrete fact. Archelaus ruled there, and the account preserves an essential detail. Joseph was afraid to go to Judea upon learning that Archelaus reigned in place of his father. That fear was not superstition, it was calculation. A new ruler may want to consolidate power by showing strength. An unpopular ruler may repress to sustain himself. And in a region loaded with messianic expectations, any rumor about a born king could be recycled by new hands. So Joseph changed course. Instead of settling in Judea, he headed north toward Galilee. This choice had strategic logic. Galilee was under a different administration, less connected to the religious and political center of Jerusalem, with a different surveillance dynamic. And within Galilee, Nazareth was the perfect destination, a place without prestige, far from the major centers, small enough to remain unnoticed by high politics, yet stable enough to live. Returning to Nazareth was not a triumphant entry, it was a silent reinsertion. Joseph once again became, in the eyes of the people, an ordinary craftsman, a man who works, repairs, and fulfills his duties. Mary returned to an environment where stories carry weight and where her past could be remembered or reinterpreted. But now she returned with a small child, and that child was a permanent social fact. Mary's body was no longer the center of judgment. The child was, and yet Nazareth offered something Judea did not: political invisibility. The household was reorganized in a key of discretion. There was no room to draw attention again. The child had to grow up like the village children, among simple tasks, modest games, learning by observation. Joseph, at this stage, took care of building a normal life. Normality, in his case, was a shield. The more normal the family appeared, the less interest it attracted. The more predictable their routine, the less fuel it provided to outside imagination. And while this normality settled in, Judea continued to change. Archelaus's rule did not become more stable. His way of governing was so conflictive and rejected that over time Rome removed him from power. This shows that Joseph's fear was not exaggerated. Archelaus was seen as a problematic ruler even within the imperial logic. Later, the region was absorbed more directly into Roman administration, but by then the family was already far north, and the child grew up in a place where no one was looking for him. Nazareth once again functioned as a refuge, not by walls, but by insignificance. There, Jesus went from being a small child to a conscious child, capable of understanding instructions, helping, observing the world with eyes that were no longer baby eyes. His story, which began with imperial decrees and real threats, was enveloped in a layer of everyday life: a humble home, a trade, a mother who preserved memory, a father who calculated risks. So they settled again, without announcing themselves, without claiming anything, and the child grew up in Nazareth under a common name and an ordinary life, while Judea continued to burn far away, governed by men who fell and were replaced by others. Hidden years in Nazareth, return, formation, and the temple episode. In Nazareth, the return brought neither applause nor public scenes. The family settled in as any household seeking to survive would, with routine, discretion, and work. The village was small with limited resources, and daily life revolved around errands, harvests, minimal exchanges, and kinship networks. For Joseph, this meant returning to the only thing he knew how to do with confidence, working with his hands, solving concrete needs, maintaining the household through his craft. Nazareth was close to larger centers in Galilee, and its proximity to places like Sepphoris meant that although the village lived in a rural mode, the Roman world was not an abstract idea. It was a nearby presence, cultural and economic, just a few kilometers away, though it did not dominate the internal rhythm of each day. Jesus grew up within this framework, not as a child removed from the real world, but as a village child, learning by observation, early absorbing social rules, understanding that work was the basis of food and that food did not fall by chance. In such households, childhood was short in practical terms, not because of a lack of affection, but because necessity accelerates learning. A child began helping early, small tasks at first, more real responsibilities later. The house demanded order, the economy demanded discipline, and the village demanded normality. Normality, for this family, was a shield. Religious life was also a structural part of growth, not as a separate subject, but as a language of belonging. The community functioned around practice, prayer, festivals, regular teaching, memory of ancient stories, and adherence to norms. Jesus grew up listening to texts, stories, and discussions that defined who they were and what was expected. Learning was not only reading, it included listening, memorizing, repeating, and asking questions. In this world, knowing how to ask well and connect stories to everyday life was a real form of intelligence. Meanwhile, Mary carried a particular memory. What she had experienced could not become a stable public conversation because the village did not function on private revelations. So Mary preserved, organized, and retained. Silence was not emptiness, it was protection. Joseph also understood silence as a method. They had crossed exile and returned with a child who needed to grow without being sought. What protected them was not an external force, it was blending in. Over time, Joseph's figure became less visible in the later narrative. There is no definitive scene, no date carved in stone. He simply stops appearing. In a household of manual labor, this absence is not interpreted symbolically. It is felt as a material change. If Joseph was no longer present, the productive structure of the home had to be reorganized, and this inevitably means that Jesus gained significance within the household from an early age, not as destiny, but as necessity. The years slipped by this way, between craft, community, and religious practice, until one of those moments arrived that recurred in Jewish life at the time. The pilgrimage to Jerusalem for one of the major festivals, especially Passover. Traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem was not done casually or without strategy. Travel was by caravan in large groups of relatives and acquaintances for security and logistics. It was easier to share routes, sleep nearby, protect children together, distribute food, and watch for dangers. In this context, the family's movement to Jerusalem was not an exceptional act, but a devotional and communal practice connecting the periphery to the center. Jesus was 12 years old when the episode that briefly broke the layer of normality occurred. 12 years old was not complete childhood. It was a transitional age, a boy old enough to move within a group, talk to adults, follow instructions, and not be attached to his mother's hand all the time. Precisely because of this, the later mistake was possible. In a caravan, a child may be with cousins, neighbors, friends, supervision is distributed. And when everything works as usual, no one suspects that something has gone off track. After the festival ended, the group began the return journey. Joseph and Mary assumed that Jesus was with some relative or with the group of children. They walked all day with this idea. Only when the movement stopped and it was time to gather did the void open. Jesus was not there. In this world, losing a child was no minor anguish. It was real danger, getting lost, accident, violence. The reaction was immediate: return to Jerusalem. The return calmed nothing. The city was large, crowded, confusing, and the child could be anywhere. They searched among acquaintances, in passageways, in places where a boy might have stayed out of curiosity or distraction. The narrative notes this harshly. It took them 3 days to find him. It is not entirely clear whether these 3 days include the day of departure and the return, or if they are 3 full days of searching in the city, but the essential point is the weight of time. For a mother and father in this context, 3 days is an abyss. When they finally found him, he was not hurt, not hiding out of fear, not crying. He was in the temple, in the courtyards where teaching and discussion took place. He was sitting among teachers, listening and asking questions. The scene does not describe Jesus preaching like an adult, but actively and intelligently participating. Questions, answers, understanding. And the effect was immediate on those who heard him, astonishment at his comprehension. Mary and Joseph reacted from the experience of terror, not from theory. Seeing him, surprise mixed with pain. Mary spoke to him with a direct sentence. "We have been anxiously searching for you." That word, anxious, is not an ornament. It is the mental state of someone who believes they have lost their child in a huge city. Jesus' response was short and disconcerting. "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" The sentence has a decisive edge because it establishes a priority. It does not deny or despise his family, but it sets a higher axis than the household. And this axis, spoken at 12 years old within the temple, produces a gap in understanding. The narrative says that they did not fully understand what he was telling them, not because they were incapable, but because the sentence points to a destiny not yet unfolded. After this tension, Jesus did not flee or rebel. He returned with them to Nazareth and remained under their authority, reintegrated into ordinary life. The episode remained as a sign, a brief intrusion that did not become immediate ministry. Work returned, routine returned, discretion returned. And the narrative summarizes this period with a concrete formula. Jesus grew in wisdom, in stature, and in grace before God and before men.